Hello, can everyone hear us? I was just talking to someone morning all, and this is us trialing post-COVID technology and making the most out of it. So we are today joined by our colleagues and our customers in Melbourne, in Brisbane, and here in Sydney. So welcome everyone. So before we get started, I'd like to begin by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the land on which we meet today. The Wurundjeri people in Melbourne, Ku-ring-gai people in Sydney, in Yagara people in Brisbane, and pay my respects to elders past, present, and emerging. And I'd also like to extend that respect to Indigenous Australians among us today and across the country. My name is Biljana Nikolova. I've met quite a few of you, and for the ones that I haven't, I'm the Executive for Government, Education, Community and Indigenous Business here at NAB. And I'll probably take a couple of minutes just to tell you a little bit about NAB Education and what gives us the license to talk to you about the education sector today. We've been around and proudly servicing the education sector for more than 150 years. We currently have more than 25 specialized education bankers around the country. And whilst we're a national business, we also bank and again are privileged to help out 1 in every 3 Australian independent schools around the country, which means that we work very closely with our customers in education. We obviously take the time to listen, observe, and again, have the privilege of being able to synthesize that knowledge and share with our customers. Closer to what's happening in the education industry and the broader economy, the Australian economy is still performing quite strongly, right? We did a stellar job through COVID. Having said that, we are starting to see a little bit of a slowdown, and the expectation is that there may be some cash flow pressures going forward, given increasing interest rates and inflation. And as we will hear this morning, pressure stemming from the rising cost of living is one of the biggest stressors for Australians. And people are not only noticing price increases more, but they're changing their spending habits and also lifestyle habits. The good news for us, though, is that we know that pretty much everything else goes before parents decide to cut on their, obviously, school fees, tutor fees, and stop spending on children. So we're in a good spot. And despite the volatile conditions, the activity in the sector is very strong. Most of our customers are continuing to focus on master plan developments. We're seeing lots of activity in that space. So this is obviously open call to all of you if we can help in any way to assist with obviously master plan developments today or into the future. Please continue to talk to your bankers, and we would love to do that for you. So why we're here today? Well, we're launching part 1 of our latest NAB Education Insight series, focusing on the well-being of high school students across Australia. And this year, for the first time, we're doing that through the eyes of our students and through the eyes of our parents. And yes, we're joined, as I mentioned, by customers and colleagues, education colleagues here in this room in Sydney and across the country. So welcome to everyone one more time. And delighted to have Jack Stevens from EdStart and his team here today. They have helped us out and collaborated with us on this event. So warm welcome to you too and to the team. And thank you for supporting us. A little bit more around well-being and in the Education Insights report. The Australian Catholic University defines student well-being as a sustainable state of positive mood and attitude, resilience and satisfaction with self, relationships and experiences at school. When students feel well, when they're happy, secure and are thriving socially, they can fully participate in and learn from their daily routines, play, interactions and experiences at school. So what emerges from this Insight report is a complex set of problems. And there is a bit of a clear divide in students' perceptions of their well-being and how parents perceive how their children feel about well-being. And interestingly enough, and we talked quite a lot about this internally in terms of obviously presenting the results, we find that quite a few of these findings won't be a surprise for schools. We believe that parents will be somewhat surprised by what actually comes through. And with these results, we're highlighting some significant challenges and opportunities for schools. So children's well-being is the shared responsibility of governments, students, wider communities, extended families, educators and parents, and it is not the sole responsibility of schools, which may not be the views of some parents. So at this point, I would like to invite Anna Ferris, our Education Plan Director in Melbourne, to introduce our first speaker, Dean Pearson, who will tell us a little bit more about the findings of the Education Insights Report. Anna, over to you.
Thanks, Biljana. So Dean Pearson is our first keynote speaker. Dean leads a team of analysts responsible for providing unique insights into our customer and business behaviour by intersecting economics, psychology, and advanced data analytics. As a behavioural economist and commentator with almost 30 years' experience, he's worked to debunk the view that humans are rational, clear-thinking beings. Instead, we behave and make choices that are often illogical and based on emotion. And if we truly understand the economy, it is important that we know the underlying emotional state and motives of the people who work and live within it. And I present Dean Pearson, our keynote speaker for today.
Thank you and good morning, everybody. As Biljana mentioned, our economy here in Australia remains remarkably resilient. Our business conditions survey that went out only a few days ago shows that business conditions are well above average. We've got a labour market that is still very strong. But as she also mentioned, we see economic growth slowing pretty sharply going forward under the pressure from higher interest rates and inflation. So the key questions really that most economists and governments are grappling with at the moment is how households will respond going forward to higher interest rates, how quickly inflation will moderate, and most importantly, how that strength in that labour market will translate through to wages growth. So overall, as I say, Australia's weathered the pandemic remarkably well, but it is also, I think, transforming the way that we think about the economy and also the way we think about society, because now we're more than 3 years into the pandemic. What's become very clear is while human beings collectively do not enjoy radical departures from their daily routines, in fact, we spend an awful lot of effort trying to avoid any change whatsoever. What we've actually discovered is we're a lot more adaptable and a lot more resilient than many of us first believed. No event in our lifetime has changed so many behaviours as suddenly and as radically as COVID-19. Now, the pandemic actually made people feel time was distorted. If you were older, you felt time slowed down. If you were younger, you felt time passed much more quickly. The pandemic has particularly disrupted the normative tasks of younger adulthood, such as schools and the transition into the workforce, being sociable and, of course, developing relationships. Younger adults, especially teens, face greater restrictions on activities and experiences that are typical of youth, and that has resulted in high levels of social anxiety across many parts of the world. Now, for a long time, as Biljana mentioned, we've wanted to do some detailed research on high school children. It's difficult. It's difficult to get a sample of kids, and we've got a representative sample of Australian children, we think, here. And as Biljana also mentioned, the results pose a lot of challenges, but also significant opportunities, we think, for schools at a time when there is an increasing focus on mental health and well-being, and more importantly, growing parental expectations around a more comprehensive, more proactive, and a more tailored well-being solution for students. Educators understand, I think, this only too well, and importantly, what comes with that, which is more pressures on budgets, more pressures on teachers, and more pressures on support staff. First, as an economist, I couldn't resist giving you a quick update of the economy. So firstly, I'll just show you quickly how we see the global economy. Now, we actually think the global economic outlook is a little bit stronger than we anticipated, largely because of the recovery in China, and advanced economies appear to be a bit more resilient than we thought. Having said that, that improvement shouldn't really be overstated. We forecast the global economy to expand by 2.6% in 2023, down from 3.4% in 2022. To put that in context, outside of the global financial crisis and the pandemic, that would represent the weakest growth rate since 2001. Our outlook for 2024 is 2.8%. That's also below the long run average of the economy between 1980 and 2021. So the world grew by that on average by about 3.4%. So it's an economy globally, it's growing, but it is not growing particularly strongly. The positive side is China. China's rebound appears to be more rapid than most of us had expected. Following the abandonment of their zero COVID policy, we had anticipated a disruptive transitional period across most of the first quarter of this year. Instead, what it looks like is most of the impact happened between mid-December and mid-January. If you look at things like subway passenger movements, traffic congestion, it really all points to a significant pickup in economic activity post the Chinese New Year holidays. So our forecast for the Chinese economy is 5.4% in 2023. Now, much will depend on the confidence, not just collectively across the world, but definitely in China, of consumers. There is no guarantee that they will unleash the built-up savings that they have amassed. Now, global inflation data, more importantly, is showing a slowing trend in consumer prices that continued into December. While global inflation might be past its peak, you're still seeing stubbornly high inflation in places like the US, the UK, and France. Stable in January, but generally inflation remains well above the targets set by global central banks, which means there, of course, is scope for further policy interest rate hikes in the coming months. And of course, there remains a number of risk factors across the world at the moment for the global outlook. There is no resolution to the Russia-Ukraine conflict. We're now 12 months into that conflict, and that continues to disrupt supply chains in energy, grains, and fertilizer markets, for example. Inflation has persisted for considerably longer than most central banks anticipated, and as I mentioned, that really does increase the risk that central banks will raise interest rates further to curb inflation. You've also, of course, got the slight problem of balloons being shot down out of the sky and some tension between two big powers at the moment. Now, moving to the next slide, please. Where do we see the Australian economy? Well, as Billy Arndt said, remarkably resilient is probably the message for Q4. You've got retail sales only coming off slightly. You've got business conditions well above long-term averages and a strong labour market. But interest rates will work, and we'll show you some of the sentiment that is building. And looking forward, growth we expect will slow quite sharply. We still think house prices will fall collectively by about 11% over 2023, which will take a peak to trough decline of about 18%. That will flow through to consumer sentiment as well. Dwelling construction, business investment are also expected to fall a little bit this year. Labour demand should soften a little bit. We've got employment growth unlikely to keep up with the sort of population growth that we're anticipating coming back post-COVID. So we have unemployment rising to around 4% by the end of 2023, drifting higher to around 4.75% by late 2024-25. What the government and what particularly the Reserve Bank will not want to see is an unemployment rate with a 5 in front of it. That will have big implications for a number of sectors. So with that dynamic continuing, we've got wages growth about 4% later in the year. That would be the highest rate of hourly wage growth since the mining boom and the upper limit of what the Reserve Bank would be comfortable with. Having said that, unemployment rising over the next 2 years, that will take some of the heat out of the wages growth, and we think they'll be back in about a 3%, mid-3% range by the end of 2025. Now, there are encouraging signs here too that inflation is starting to moderate a little bit, but it's coming back, although it is still remaining quite stubbornly high. So we've got a cash rate that went up again in February by 25 basis points to 3.35%. The Reserve Bank wasn't very subtle in saying they think there are more rate rises coming. We anticipate a peak in the cash rate of 4.1% in May. That includes 25 basis point rises at each of the next 3 meetings. So a cash rate, when it gets above 4%, that will impact economic growth. Hence our expectation, as you can see, for GDP growth of below 1% in both 23 and 24. Enough of economics and other parts of economics, which is more important in my world at the moment. Now, by many measures, Australia is overwhelmingly a more prosperous and a better generation than previous generations have enjoyed. We've longer, we've got healthier lives, we've got bigger, better homes, we've got more education, we've got more comfort, we've got more convenience and more wealth. At the same time, almost half of Australians will face mental ill health during their lives. Suicide is the main cause of death amongst Australians aged 15 to 49 years. Now, GDP is closely tracked as the key benchmark for our prosperity, but it tells us very little about how people feel, their individual well-being or their happiness. And to be fair, it was never intended to do that. Now, for about a decade, we've been tracking wellbeing based on the methodology of a man called Daniel Kahneman, who won a Nobel Prize in economics in 2002, whereby wellbeing is measured across a number of domains: happiness, life satisfaction, life worth, and anxiety. Happiness, as Kahneman describes, is a momentary experience. Satisfaction is a long-term feeling. The somewhat depressive conclusion that Mr. Kahneman came to about 10 years ago is basically people don't want to be happy. What we actually care about is having a really good story about our lives. We care less about enjoying ourselves than presenting the appearance of an enviable existence. Now, why do we bother measuring wellbeing? Well, I've tried to articulate this, but the words of Richard Layard from the London School of Economics is much better than me. How people feel is the deepest reality of their experience of life. It's the way we should think about the quality of a person's life, how they experience it, not as we think it might be. And economists, above all other people, are guilty of assuming that we know how people feel about their lives. Now, it seemed likely that COVID would impact wellbeing, and of course it did. Wellbeing collapsed in the first quarter after COVID hit. But what quickly happened was a V-shaped recovery. We saw a V-shaped economic recovery. We also saw a V-shaped recovery in wellbeing. Some people started to report positive experiences related to COVID: greater work-life balance, more quality time with family. They were living more simply. They felt more empathy. But what we also saw is the gap between people experiencing high levels of wellbeing and low levels of wellbeing started to widen, and that hasn't been narrowed. And more recently, the last wellbeing result we have is for the fourth quarter of 2022, and wellbeing started to fall again, largely on the back of rising anxiety. Now, this is, I think, the scope of the problem in one slide. I think of all the things that I did in the last 18 months, this survey really scared me a little bit. We asked Australians, to what extent do you believe you would need professional help for your emotion, stress, or mental health over the past year? 4 in 10, this is a representative sample of the Australian population, 40% of us said we would have benefited from that help. Now, there was little difference between the responses of men and women, but there was a significant difference by age. Those aged between 18 to 24, 7 in 10 said that they would have needed professional help for their mental health had they got it. What's challenging for a government, and what's really important, is of the people who got it, they said it was of significant help. Only about half the people who said they needed it actually got access to it. Now, the OECD looks at wellbeing, student wellbeing, as psychological, cognitive, social, physical, and the capabilities students need to live a happy and fulfilling life. Within that, they're basically saying it's important that students develop skills to improve their wellbeing, both in the present and in the future. Now, there are various surveys of student wellbeing employed across Australian schools, and they provide really good, significant existing data sets. As discussed for more than a decade, we've got our own. Now, the personal nature of some of the questions in these sort of surveys means that they can be triggering for some children. Moreover, some kids just might not answer them honestly. Now, for this reason, we chose to simply ask about 400 students across the country between years 7 and 12 how they would score themselves on their emotional and mental and physical well-being. But as Biljana mentioned, we also asked about 500 parents how they think their children were feeling. Now, the purpose was not to provide another measure of well-being, but simply to gain a better understanding of how children view their lives. And I would agree with Biljana, because I've sat there with many discussions that we've had about these results and how they might be interpreted, or more importantly, how they might be misinterpreted. So I turn towards someone who knows a lot more about this than me, the renowned child developmental psychiatrist, Dr. Stanley Greenspan, and he provides, I think, some pretty good context and how these findings should be interpreted. And he says, parent blaming isn't only cruel and unfair, it is nonsensical. The quality of caregiving is heavily, even decisively determined by the societal context in which it takes place. But what I do think this research does really well is to shine a light on the complexity of the challenges facing schools when addressing student wellbeing from both a child and a parent's perspective. Now, when children complain that their parents don't understand them, and mine certainly do, often what they're basically saying is, you don't understand how I feel. Now, misperceptions are a pretty natural part of parenting. Often we tend to see our children through our own fears, our own desires, and our own issues. But again, this is not to imply that parents don't care. In fact, quite the opposite. But what the survey does show is a very clear divide in students' perceptions of their wellbeing and how parents think it might be. Okay, thank you. Parents view their children's wellbeing much more positively. They report higher wellbeing for girls boys are much higher, than girls. By year level, physical wellbeing is highest in years 7 to 9, lowest in year 11. And then this is through the eyes of the kids themselves. When it came to emotional and mental wellbeing, we also noted a very large gap between boys and girls. Students at private independent schools rate highest. By year level, emotional and mental wellbeing was highest in years 7 to 9 and by far lowest in years 12. We can see in this chart that if the average, so if you ask someone to score an average between 1 and 100, it tends to mask those people who score very low. And this shows you those people who scored under 40, so quite low out of 100. 1 in 5, that was, who had low levels of emotional or mental wellbeing. About 15% identified as having low physical wellbeing. By comparison, 1% of parents thought that their children had low levels of physical wellbeing. 4% of parents thought they had low levels of emotional or mental wellbeing. Low levels of emotional or mental wellbeing were 5 times more prevalent in girls-only schools, again, self-reported by the children and the teens, I should say, than boys-only schools. Nearly twice as many girls overall reported low physical wellbeing than boys. So we move to the next slide, please. We can see, many children have been clearly uniquely impacted by the pandemic, having experienced this crisis during important periods of their physical, social, and emotional development. Now, there are a number of credible research bodies that will report some students are more distracted, more disobedient, more unsettled in their friendships since the pandemic, which raises concerns that the protracted isolation that they have endured has had a lingering effect on children's development and social maturity. Now, a really important question is, are you feeling any better than you felt a year ago? On balance, only 18% of children said, I'm rating my physical wellbeing better, compared to 55% of parents who said it is improved. In terms of emotional wellbeing, only 9% of students said it had improved compared to a net 51% of parents. Now, of course, feeling lonely and senses of loneliness is very normal, and almost everyone, of course, will be affected by loneliness at some point in their lives. Loneliness is an internal feeling, and it's quite possible that a person can feel lonely despite being surrounded by a lot of people. Often when we read about the effects of loneliness, we are talked about in regards to older adults, particularly those very much in the later stages of life. But there is ample evidence that loneliness amongst young people is associated with increased anxiety. COVID containment measures, including social distancing, disrupted many of the normal social interactions for most people. Young people have reported substantial increases in feelings of loneliness during the pandemic. Many adults assumed that, and I think I may have made this assumption, that many young people would find it easy to maintain their relationships virtually because they're so tech savvy, using their phones, using technology, playing video games and so forth. But it's been really challenging for some. We know that touch, we know proximity are really important to feeling socially connected as well. So how prevalent is loneliness amongst students? Quite a bit more than parents might think. When students were asked to rate how lonely they feel, on average, it was 44 out of 100. However, again, using that low range, the bottom cohort of kids, it was pretty high. It's about 1 in 4 amongst boys, or about 25%. What's really interesting when you survey teenagers is the extent to which boys and girls will engage on different questions. Boys are quite happy to answer that question. They're not so happy to answer a question that's coming up. So like loneliness, if we go to the next slide, please, thank you. Anxiety, of course, is also a natural human state, but for some, it can weigh really heavily on their sense of well-being. When school children were asked to rate how well they thought they were coping with their anxieties, on balance, they rated only moderately well, 54 out of a possible 100. Parents, however, scored them about 72. Of concern, a very large number, over 1 in 3, said they were not coping well. Higher numbers, again, of girls than boys. As I say, boys are less prepared to lean into, well, I'm not okay, whereas girls certainly are. Thank you. Now, when we asked these teens what the top 5 causes of their anxieties or worries were, parents were also asked the same question. The biggest driver of anxiety for students was schoolwork, tests, or grades, which impacted 2 in 3 of them as their top response. Over 4 in 10 called out looks, appearance, body image, and rounding out the top 5, as you can see, is mental health, tiredness, lack of sleep, and future job prospects. Parents underestimated how prevalent these stresses were across the board. Instead, parents thought their children's friendships was significantly more important in regards to their anxiety. Interestingly, about 1 in 5 parents said their children did not have any personal concerns or worries, compared to about 4% of students. Now, the common approach, of course, for measuring the effectiveness of an education system or a school is the impact of school interventions on students' academic performance. But increasingly, it's also being argued that non-academic achievement should also be considered. School effectiveness has been examined in hundreds of studies. In many cases, they highlight the low impact of school factors at a student level, while socioeconomic background was a much better predictor of student wellbeing, which makes it much more difficult for schools to combat its substantial influence. In this research, we asked parents how well they thought the school was helping their child with their anxieties or worries. On average, they scored it quite highly at about 68. Overall, about 13% of parents said, were in that very low cohort, they didn't believe the school was helping much. It was particularly high amongst parents of children in years 11. Falls from about 25% of concern in years 11 to 3 in year 12. They perceive a substantial change in the nurturing environment between 11 and 12. So on Monday, we're going to release, as Biljana said, part 1 of this new education series, which will focus on wellbeing. And in a few weeks' time, we'll release part 2, which will focus on the school lives of students, including their enjoyment, when they start and finishing times, their preference, about school curriculum, skills, teachers, general problems and concerns. Now, I don't want to go into detail today about the second report, but I did want to show you a couple of insights that I think are very pertinent and related to wellbeing. Now, feeling positive about school, because we asked a really basic question. We asked kids, do you enjoy school? Because feeling positive about your school environment is associated with higher attendance, better classroom adjustment, more engagement, higher academic achievement. Now, of course, kids don't, as my son will attest, they don't have to love school to experience a lot of the benefits of school, but for some, that dislike of school can become quite pervasive. So overall, the results show that, you know, when you say to a kid between 13 and 18, do you like school? They score at about 59 out of 100. Parents score at about 75. Almost 1 in 4 students, though, scored their enjoyment of school life low, compared to 4% of parents. That said, almost 3 in 10 greatly enjoyed school. They scored at 80 or more. The number who scored it high was noticeably higher amongst boys than girls. What do students like and dislike? Students in the 2 groups of like and dislike like different things, which again compounds the challenges that you've all got, I'm sure. While friends and socialising is the most liked aspect of school for both groups, a much higher proportion of school likers than dislikers choose learning. These findings, of course, are pretty intuitive, but they resonate with previous research which shows students with a history of disruptive behaviour also will nominate schoolwork and teachers as their big concerns. Now, around 3 in 4 students, because kids, you know, while they're complaining in some respects, they really do appreciate the quality of education they're receiving today. 3 in 4, 74% believe they're getting a better education than their parents did. And the number who think they're getting a better education is somewhat higher in public and state schools compared to private, independent and Catholic schools. But this realisation is most appreciated during the final year of school. And you can see in year 12. Year 12 noticeably more, 82% of year 12 students say I'm getting a better education than my parents. Now, education and school communities play a significant role in supporting and developing student wellbeing. Schools, of course, use various different strategies and programs, including school-wide mental health and wellbeing promotion, early targeted support for students with emerging or moderate concerns, and targeted or crisis response for students with complex medical and mental health needs. My brother-in-law is a principal of a pretty big school, so I get to hear a lot about the complexity of that challenge. Parents, however, lack awareness of wellbeing programs offered by schools, and I think that's a bit of a concern here. While 2 in 3 students said their school had a wellbeing program, and I'm sure it's much higher than that, only 4 in 10 parents thought that they did. The lowest number of parents who said their children's school had a wellbeing program were in the public or state school sector. Significantly more students at girls-only schools said that they had a wellbeing program for their children than did students with children at boys-only schools or co-educational schools. Now, in the somewhat biased eyes of students, wellbeing initiatives provided by the schools don't help that much. They scored at about 46 out of 100. Parents score at about 75 out of 100 in terms of how those wellbeing programs are helping their children. By school type, students at private independent schools said they helped most. Overall, 1 in 2 students said they did not help much, whereas just 6% of parents said they offered little help to their children. So what can schools do? What do students believe their school could do most to help with their anxieties or worries? According to students, the top 5 things are putting less emphasis on grades and scores, fewer tests and exams, teachers who are more calm, honest and caring, a less strict policy on uniforms and appearance, and less homework. Now, parents also highlighted some things such as professional counselling and wellbeing services, more safe places, more opportunities for check-ins with students, more feedback on progress and academic performance, and more focus on core subjects. Again, a lot more parents said there was nothing the school could do. Only 2% of kids said there was nothing the school could do. So here's some of the responses that we got from students when we asked them what would help most in a school wellbeing program. And we got lots of responses. You can collectively bucket them, I think, into 3 areas. 1, anonymity, 2, academic support, and 3, professional help. Anonymity was overwhelmingly the big response we got from students. There were lots of comments saying, I feel awkward talking to my teacher. I don't feel comfortable. They will contact my parents. I know that they're required to talk to my parents after I talk to them if I raise any issue, therefore I'm not going to. Academic support. A lot of kids saying, well, my biggest problem with my well-being is the fact that I've got so much schoolwork and I'm feeling under so much pressure. I need more help in that area rather than more meditation programs and so forth. And finally, which is a bit of a free hit from kids, I need more professional help. My problems are real problems. Therefore, I need a psychologist or a professional counsellor. So I think this is a really interesting chart. And this shows the real complexity that I think you all face. So once again, it shows the top 5 things students believe schools could do to improve their wellbeing. But this time, the overall results are in red. But against that is the group of students, the responses from 1 in 4 of those kids who said they really didn't enjoy school, and they're in black. So while students who don't enjoy school want similar things from the kids that do, there are 2 really important differences. One is they want more support for problems at home, and the other one is more remote learning. Now, there's a lot of research in regards to children who live in abusive or toxic home environments and how it places more pressure on teachers to go above and beyond to create that safe space. Control seems to be really important for those kids, where they sit, the projects they work on, how they get help. Maintaining class structure seems to be really important too, to give them some sort of stability. Now, also, while remote learning during the pandemic brought a lot of challenges, some students also reported that they thrived. A handful of them, maybe particularly shy kids, hyperactive kids, highly creative kids, some suddenly started to do better in school. But for some, of course, that unplanned break was pretty severe. Of course, just as demand for new wellbeing initiatives grow, rising expenses, wage costs and cuts to government funding are driving up the cost of many schools. School fee increases, some of which have exceeded inflation, are adding to the cost of living for Australian families. But rising costs are not affecting demand, with the percentage of students attending private schools increasing solidly over the past few years, significantly outpacing the growth in government schools. The concern, of course, is that some cash-strapped parents struggling with rising mortgage costs might turn to unsecured loans. Cost of living pressure, is clearly adding to the collective sense of financial stress. Around 1 in 3 Australians currently believe their finances are a very big cause of stress. We have something called a Household Financial Stress Index, which looks at the role our finances have on our wellbeing. It's derived from several key potential household pressures, including meeting the cost of healthcare, mortgage repayments, rent, credit cards, education, food and basic necessities. It's now at a 4-year high. It jumps pretty sharply in Q4. 1 in 4 Australians identify as struggling to make ends meet. Just go back to that one, please. So the top 5 causes of stress. So, when people say, what's the relationship between economics and well-being? Well, I think this is clearly it. The top 5 causes of stress, not just financial stress, but all stress in people's lives by Australians. Number 1, identified by over 1 in 2, is the cost of living. That's ahead of things like health issues, personal financial issues, the economy, and mental health. Other common factors include things like stress levels related to family and housing costs. Those living cost stresses are particularly problematic amongst that 30 to 49 age group. Personal financial issues amongst young people is pretty horrendous. Now, these pressures are not only impacting people in terms of how they feel, but their actual behaviours at the same time. So if we go to the next slide, please, we can see that consumers are not only noticing price increases more, but they're changing their spending and their lifestyle patterns to tackle them. Consumers are buying still, but they are much more considered in their spending. They're focusing much more on their outgoings, they're prioritising essentials, and they're cutting back wherever they can. 4 in 10 consumers tell us they've cut back on buying treats such as coffees and lunches, on car journeys to save petrol. They're cancelled or cutting back on entertainment such as going to the cinema. 1 in 3 have cancelled, delayed, or made more modest holiday plans, or cancelled or cut back on food delivery, except for my son, Uber Eats and Menulog. It's interesting though, where they're not cutting back, and that's the sweet spot that you're in. Much less likely to want to cut back on private school fees, private tutors, and children's activities such as sport. Also, our pet comes pretty close to our kids in terms of where we don't want to cut back on. Now, to some extent, those sort of responses are intentions rather than actions. And we know the lure of our old life is pretty strong. You look at Netflix, for example, they lost 1 million subscribers worldwide during the second quarter of 2022. And then they lost another lot of subscribers. More recently, in the past 2 quarters, they've added more subscribers than they lost in the 3rd and 4th quarters. They've also launched an ad-based service as well. But people think they can give things up, but it's becoming a bit difficult. Now, as interest rates continue to rise, thank you, mortgage stress is also increasing. Mortgage stress dropped to record lows in 2022 as record interest rates and tens of billions of dollars of government stimulus combined to reduce the number of mortgage holders considered at risk. Of course, now we've got a growing number of people who are entering the so-called mortgage cliff, which arises from the rollover of fixed rate mortgages taken out in mid-2020 or to early 2022 at interest rates of about 2.5%, transitioning within 18 months into loans of about 5.5% to 6%. By late 2022, very few borrowers were fixing their loans compared to about 46% in August 2021 at their peak. Now, this is a pretty simple way of measuring stress. How are homeowners feeling about the prospect of rate rises? That level of concern rose really substantially about 6 months ago. It's still rising. About 1 in 2 Australians now think that another rate hike would cause them a lot of stress in regards to their mortgage. Now, financial stress falls across a whole range of spectrum of severity, from general concerns about the availability of money to difficulty in paying for most basic essentials and paying your bills. So we also track sentiment in regards to financial hardship. So people not just feeling financially stressed, but actually identifying that they've fallen into some sort of hardship. In Q4, 4 in 10 Australians identify as experiencing some form of hardship. And that number has risen substantially since the start of 2022. It's now at its highest level in nearly 3 years. Hardship most prevalent amongst those aged 18 to 29, where about 57% of them identify that. Moreover, the biggest form of hardship that people are identifying is not having enough money for an emergency. We're drawing down our savings, and that is making people increasingly concerned about an emergency. Also, number 2, worryingly, is not having enough for food or basic necessities and being unable to pay a bill. So to sum all that up, I think there's really little doubt that the pandemic has disrupted the lives of many young people, and the impacts are continuing to be felt today. I think our research really underpins the complexity of the challenges that you all face when addressing student wellbeing. Parents clearly want the best for their children, but in some cases don't fully understand how they're feeling, and I suspect the pressures that you are under to help kids navigate both their academic performance and their physical and their mental wellbeing. While I don't, as Biljana started off mentioning, I don't expect schools will be surprised by this report, but I do think some parents might be. And of course, as wellbeing becomes a more complex issue, cost pressures on schools are increasing at a time when parents are increasingly sensitive to the cost of living. But I think what is also very clear is how much parents value the education their children are receiving, and particularly how reluctant they are to cut back on education and other activities for their children. Thank you very much.
Dean, thank you. Thank you very much for the insightful presentation. I hope everyone found it useful. As Dean mentioned earlier, we will be circulating or sharing the report with you next week when we will officially launch with the general public. There will be a question Q&A session after the next presentation. So yeah, would love to hear your views and if any questions from the audience. Now it is my absolute pleasure to introduce the next speaker, Jack Stevens. Jack is the CEO of EdStart. As many of you know, EdStart is a technology and financial services company which provides funding and payment services for education. Jack has extensive experience across the finance and education sector and held senior consulting and corporate finance roles at KPMG prior to founding EdStart in 2016. Jack is a qualified chartered accountant and a board director at the Australian Industry Trade College. Jack, over to you.
Thank you, Biljana. Thank you very much. Put some slides up here as well. Thanks for having us. Thanks for co-hosting to the NAB team. Thanks, Dean, for your presentation as well. And I think for me personally, some of the most interesting insights there to actually ask kids about how they're feeling, and then the interesting contrast for how parents are then thinking about that. So I found that fantastic. Just the agenda from here, as Biljana said, I'm going to talk here for 20 minutes or so, Q&A time, and then, welcome to stay on after that. Just to give a sense of what I'm going to run through today, which is a slightly different lens to where Dean went, and trying to we've just heard about how students are feeling. We've heard a little bit about parents and their household dynamic. Now we're going to focus right in on specifically those parents. So for business managers, for those running schools, I think one of the most interesting insights is what sits on the other side of those bank accounts from which the school fees are paid. And that is what we're going to try to unpack a little bit in here. So specifically, 4 areas. School fees for 2023. What did parents actually expect versus what actually happened? Family budgets. What's actually going on right now? What are the specific family behaviours for this cohort of parents? So parents attending, or parents with children attending non-government schools. Interest rates, which Dean's already touched on. And lastly, this idea of what is the reality of parent behaviour, family wellbeing, parent behaviour, and how that flows through to school interaction, particularly in the form of enrolments, which is what's most interesting, of course, to many schools. That's what we're going to run through. Now, just a little bit about why the hell is EdStart here, and what are we even talking about? Some of you may have never heard of EdStart. As Biljana said, we operate within the school space, and particularly around payments and funding. So we believe a few really important things. 1, that education is the most powerful investment you can make. 2, that financial services, particularly consumer-facing ones, can be delivered much better, and that is with the help of technology. And we believe firmly that technology should optimise, not replace human interaction, particularly in financial services. We work with about 600 different schools around the country, and what we try and do with insights like this is take the data that we've actually got, and particularly the data that schools themselves can't get their hands on. And that's particularly around parents, parent bank accounts, and payments. For context there, EdStart these days, the majority of what we do is actually managing all of the school fees at a school. So a complete school fee management service for the school. So the reason for explaining that is that we see the entire spectrum of the parent base, those that are paying a whole amount to the school up front, maybe they're paying years in advance in some case, the ones that are paying termly, monthly, fortnightly, weekly, or even want to spread out over a longer period of time. We're looking after all of them. And so that's where this data set comes from, and why I hope you guys find this interesting and useful. So to start with, we're talking about fees, school fees for 2023. What were parents actually expecting? When we asked them at the end of last year, what do you expect your school fees are going to go up by next year? 27%, less than 1%.
Wishful thinking.
Oh my goodness. 41%, 1 to 3%. Very, very few up in this region, which of course is the reality of what went on. When we break that down a little bit, was there a difference between the states? Not really, other than South Australia. what's really interesting about that is that South Australia consistently for 2 years has had the lowest fee increases in the country, but for some reason the parents there actually expected higher fees. Did it differ by school fee range? Schools, charging 40 grand a year or schools charging 3 grand a year? Yes, absolutely. So schools at low fee, parents at lower fee schools certainly expected lower increases. In fact, those paying less than 10,000 a year were expecting, or 75% of them were expecting a less than 3% fee increase. And did it differ by year level? Not so much, but perhaps a little bit as reaching the end of schooling, parents had a slightly more realistic expectation of fee increases. So, what then actually happened? What was the actual average school fee increase for 2023? If I can just quickly survey the room. So maybe those that thought the average was 3%, 4%, 5%, 6% or more. Very interesting. The average was in fact 4.5%. But this chart is showing why that was so different. For the last 15 to 20 years, we have had the consistent behaviour of school fees, which is this darker blue line here, the increases in those outstripping inflation. That has been the consistent theme of the last 2 decades. That, of course, slowed here in COVID and completely turned around last year. 7.3% was CPI. School fees increased by only 4.5%. So it's fairly obvious why that is. That's an unusual inflation figure, but it is a big change to school fee behaviour. So coming back to expectations, of course, we had a fairly significant gap because the average was up here. Many schools went way above 5%. The highest that we've seen so far is about 15%. But the vast majority of parents did not expect that. Whether you believe that or not, or it was just wishful thinking, who knows? But there's certainly a level of expectations. The other area just to touch on is that notion of the differences in school fee range. So lower fee schools had the lowest school fee increase. But to dive slightly further into that, when you look at the CTC score, you look at capacity to contribute and the new methodology, of course, that's now driving that, that was really the indicator of different school fee increase behaviour. So those schools with a CTC score above 100 were right up here at 5%. Those schools with a CTC score below 100, more like 3 to 3.5%. It's fairly obvious. Of course, this score drives directly the level of government funding that's being received, and typically these schools have a larger percentage of their revenue coming from the government as opposed to parents. So fairly obvious, but fascinating. And I think just to touch on something we're doing with a few of our partner schools this year is actually looking at the underlying parent data here to help schools optimise that CTC score, which is a very interesting concept that we're working on this year as well. But putting that aside, that's the behaviour on school fee increases for 2023. Moving now to the actual family budget, the family behaviour. So school fees have gone up, yes, bang. The school fees are now flowing out of those parents' bank accounts, you hope. What else is going on in those parent bank accounts? That here is what we're going to dive into a little bit. The fundamental problem came through in some of Dean's insights as well is this, which is wage growth and inflation have been very consistent. 2018, 19, 20, even 2021, 2022 starting to shift, inflation going up, wages not keeping up. 2023, inflation going right up, wages not matching it, despite media attention that would suggest the opposite. On average, wage growth is not keeping pace with inflation, and it probably will not. There is not a strong sentiment at the moment for employers to be handing out 7% pay increases across the board. It's just not happening. So this gap continues to widen the fundamental problem that we're talking about. This is specifically private school families. What's going on in the background? What have families been sacrificing over the past year? Aligns a little bit with what Dean was saying as well. Dine to rate out less, adjustments to groceries, etc., etc. I challenge this first point because I'm trying to get restaurant reservations and finding that I still can't get them. So I really don't know whether that's actually happening. But certainly consistent with what Dean was saying, around 10, 11% here in our survey looking at schooling arrangements. Now, whether that's dropping out of a school altogether, changing schools, or maybe delaying the entry year level is certainly starting to happen. And this question we asked here was about payments and payment flexibility. So we asked parents at EdStart schools, to what extent did the flexibility that EdStart offers help you to stay at the school? And about 75% said it had an impact. To some extent, to a lot, or we wouldn't have been able to keep our children at the school. So that payment flexibility point is a really interesting one in terms of dealing with the other challenges that's going on in the parents' bank account. Now, moving on here to a little bit of the interest rate impact. I'm going to go slightly different data sets here to what Dean has talked about. So this is really asking the question of what's going on with mortgage. That is, for our parents, the largest household spend on average. The second largest on average is the school, but the largest is the mortgage on average. So what's going on with mortgage and how does that flow through to the affordability of education? So interest rate impacts. We know, of course, what's going on at the RBA, but it's really, I think, important to understand that looking at the current cohort of parents you have at the schools right now, whether your school offers 6 or 7 or 13 years of schooling, those parents that are currently there, the current cohort, have not seen interest rates at this level. They have been at the school during this period to some extent. They have not seen interest rates at the current level. So that's the first thing to be aware of. The second thing is that very few parents in the school today would have seen the steepness of this curve. This is every single rate rise cycle since 1994. So that includes the 94 hikes, 99, 02, 06, 09, and now the one that started in 2022. The steepness here is unlike what's been experienced before. It would be unlikely you'd have any parents at the school who were also paying mortgages in 1994. So this is a new experience. And looking at system-wide data from APRA and the RBA about fixed rate mortgages, a lot of talk about the fixed rate adjustment cliff, which means all the parents right now that are paying here at 2 and 2.5% on their mortgage, and about 50% of those will be rolling off, probably onto a variable rate during 2023. But more importantly, they're rolling off that at a rate that is 2 to 3 times what they were previously fixed at. Now, that is going to vary hugely parent to parent, but the fundamental point about $1 million mortgage that was costing you $20,000 2 years ago, it's still costing you $20,000 a year because you're fixed today, and it's going to start costing you $60,000 a year if your mortgage rate goes to 6, is dramatic. And particularly in Sydney and Melbourne, the cohort of parents that have still got $1 million mortgages plus is large. Now, final section before we move on to Q&A is then taking a little bit of that and saying, Family wellbeing. What does that really mean? What is really going on in parent behaviour, and how can schools actually support that? What can schools actually do today that's meaningful and has an impact? The first thing I want to point out is that consumer sentiment, and this surprised me, is actually at its lowest level in a generation. It is lower than it was at the trough of the pandemic, and it is lower than it was in the GFC. Consumer sentiment is the lowest in this generation. It is particularly bad for those that have a mortgage. They're way down here. No mortgage or renting's up here. You've got a mortgage, you're not feeling great at the moment. You're feeling highly concerned. And what that means for schools is that these parents, the current cohort of parents, are probably feeling the most nervous, the most uncertain, the most shifty that they have in the entire period that they've been at the schools. What that flows into, I'm just going to highlight 3 themes here of real examples, real parent behaviour. So taking this data set, how does that flow through into actual parent behaviour? The first is social pressures. The second is aspirational families. And the third is flowing into poor credit options. So the first example here is that because of the social construct and social pressure that goes on in relation to schooling, we've got a dynamic where there's often a notion of hiding a sense of financial hardship, particularly from a school. A couple of recent case study schools. You look at actual family dynamic over here that we can see, and you compare that with what the family is telling the school. In both of those cases, about double the number of families were actually in financial hardship compared to what they were telling the school. So for whatever number of parents are mentioning financial hardship to the school, there is probably double, if not more, than that in reality. The second is aspirational families. We know that the growth in independent schooling continues. Many families attending independent schooling for the first time, the first of generations of their family. What this often means is that there's some short-term planning towards it, but there is a very common theme about families saving up for their first year of schooling and not much beyond that, not much planning beyond that, and perhaps certainly not planning for the crunch where maybe 3 kids are overlapping. Now, this is a really common theme. I'm talking here about real examples of real behaviour. And then finally is the use of poor credit options. So the number of families, and I know most schools accept credit card as a payment method, but the number of families that will be blowing up 5, 6, 7 credit cards and paying the school on time, every time, is dramatic. We see the data from that all the time. So there's a lot of that. There's using personal loans, and there's a lot of short-sighted behaviour with mortgage redraws where parents end up costing themselves multiple hundreds of thousands of extra interest over a 20, 25-year period for poor use of credit options for school fees. So these are real things that we see all the time, examples. So to wrap up there, some action points that schools can take to combat some of these themes, and that behaviour, of course, is being driven by some of those data points that we showed. Fee payment clarity. There is a historical notion amongst many schools of pretending that the fees don't exist and sort of just hoping for the best. That behaviour has kind of died. It no longer matches up with parent expectations. Fee information should be communicated clearly. It should be open. It should mention payment options that are available, and it should encourage parent communication about fees. The days of school fees being a hidden head in the sand, hope for the best are over. It's no longer what parents expect. The second is early action or early intervention. There are very simple things that schools can do to flag patterns early. For example, if you're a school that runs automated payments of any sort, it is so simple to have a daily or a weekly report about the number of missed payments that are occurring, even if you don't do anything with that data, to just throw in that report out of whatever system you're using is so simple to implement and just will immediately tell you trends and patterns. That is the most real-time information that schools can get. For EdStart partner schools, where we're running all the payments, of course, we provide this insight to schools. Genuine flexibility. The notion of paying lump sums for anything has also kind of died out in the current generation of parents. Everything else in their life, from utility bills, cars, to holidays, they're all paid flexibly in line with their own income. If your school fee payments are not in line with the parent's income, you're just straight away making that an unnecessary challenge. And finally, I think with the potential wave of hardship that's coming through, remember it will be different to the previous wave of hardship we've just seen. This is not a pandemic. This is not a sudden open shut of the economy. It's much more likely to be permanent. So that's my 4 key actionable points for schools. And that brings me to the end of the session today. So thanks, Biljana, and thanks all.
Thank you very much. As usual, very, very insightful and again, interesting, challenging times. But at the same time, I would like to go back to Dean's observation that we're a resilient nation. So hopefully we will obviously need to proactively deal with some of the issues that are coming through. But I would like to think that there will be obviously a progressive way forward. We've reached the Q&A point in today's session. So Anna, maybe over to you and to Matt to help us out run this part of the presentation. And a little bit hard to hear you.
I'm sorry, we're going to take questions starting Melbourne, then Sydney and Brisbane for Dean or Jack or the general audience. So if we had any initial questions from Melbourne, we'll start here.
I just wanted to ask a question or, get some commentary related to the first presentation. Just with the wellbeing piece, what are you also seeing with regard to, and not to put it delicately, but like say a lack of resilience in our young people? Because, there's previous generations that have gone through tremendous hardship as well. And just, the generation that the young people that are around today and maybe some correlations around that.
Yeah, it's a tricky one because if you look at the rates of anxiety and mental health conditions now versus previous generations, they are substantially higher. So part of the question is, well, is that because life is a bit more stressful, or is that just because we talk about anxiety more so we're actually measuring it more accurately than we were in the past? I'm in the mindset that it's a combination of things, but it includes a change in the socioeconomic structure in this country, and across the world. There is a gross disconnect between the wealth and opportunities that people experience today and how they report. I suppose that the way that we measure well-being is it almost doesn't matter, the answer to that question. What does matter is how they feel, and how they feel is substantial. So is it a lack of resilience? Well, I think COVID's probably proven that we are incredibly a resilient group. I think for the vast majority of kids, they have snapped back quite well post-COVID, but I do think there is a cohort, particularly that cohort who struggled at home before COVID, who are continuing to struggle. So that's the billion-dollar question that psychologists and psychiatrists are trying to work out. But my broader answer would be there is something fundamentally broken at the moment with how children are feeling in terms of their anxiety. If that's resilient, potentially, is that back to parents not being tough enough on kids? Is that, who knows? But there is a problem, and the problem's gotten worse generation.
Thanks, Dean. Juliana, could you look to the room for a question from the audience?
Any questions in the room here?
If not, we might pass it
We
to
seem to be good in Sydney, Anna.
we'll pass it to our Brisbane colleagues. Damien, anyone in the room?
Nothing up here, thanks.
No problem. We'll go to Melbourne again. Thank you.
Dean, just the disconnect between parents' views,
Yep.
how their children are feeling and their view, the
Yep.
children's views. I'm not sure whether you can draw any conclusions from the data and the analysis that you've done, but
Yep.
what do you think that disconnect is? Is that parents being really busy, out of touch, not communicating, a whole range of
Yep.
potential factors, but is there anything you've been able to gain from your work that's kind of sharing insight with us today?
It's a challenge. Sorry, the question was around the disconnect between parent and children responses. Psychology will sort of tell you that if you go to Disneyland and you come back from your holiday from Disneyland, you say to people, "How was Disneyland?" And they say it was fantastic. We went on the Magic Mountain or whatever it's called, and we had the go. If you actually ask people during, and the longer that track is, the better the experience gets. If you ask them while they're there, they stood in the queue for about 3 or 4 hours. It took a long time. The kids were crying. It was hot. The longer that distance progresses, we edit history, and our memories will basically say it was the greatest day of our life. I do think to some extent, and what we know with our wellbeing research is the happiest people in our wellbeing research are older people, and particularly widows, but that's for a whole different reason. So I think, and this was the big concern that Bill and I talked about. We're not saying that parents are hopeless and they don't understand their children, but what we are saying is it's really hard as a 55-year-old person to stand there and go, "I know how you feel," because that child won't feel like the people who are most scared of retirement are people who are about to retire. The people who are most happy have just entered retirement. Reality is quite different to perception. But I think, rightly or wrongly, that if I was a school, I would look at this and go, "My God, this is challenging." I've got parents who say wellbeing is really, really important. I've got parents who are increasingly saying, "And it's your responsibility because I'm paying you a fair bit of money." So I remember I had a principal say to me about 10 years ago, and it changed the way we did research here. When I first started, when a child would come home and the father or mother would say, "How was your day at school?" And he said to me, that used to mean, "How was your day at school?" Now, increasingly, it means, "For God's sake, don't tell me there's a problem at school because I'm paying $35,000 a year." Happy. Huge challenge. But I think the thing that we hopefully can show, and schools can use this, is just that kids do feel these feelings are really complex, and maybe parents don't quite appreciate what you guys collectively are fronting into dealing with these challenges. But yeah, so yeah, I think the kids will feel a lot better 20, 30 years from now. That doesn't help now though.
Are there any other questions or Brisbane? Otherwise, I might open it back to Melbourne.
Can I ask a question? Dean, any views or any evidence of who's doing this well? Like, are there any examples out there within the, I guess, independent school cohort that is achieving good results in this space, in the wellbeing space?
I think collectively, most schools are doing this as well as they possibly can, given the complexity of it. I think the schools that are doing it particularly well are the schools that recognise that each child has to be seen as an individual, and some of the things that concern one child don't necessarily concern another. I think the big issue that comes through this, which I haven't got an answer for, is the whole ethics of anonymity. The kids are really saying, "I want more help, but I'm not comfortable sharing that with you because I think you're going to tell my mum and dad." That's a big challenge. I think the schools that are integrating, I talk about pets way too much. The number one positive driver of wellbeing for an Australian is their pet. Ahead of their relationship, ahead of all sorts of other things, is a pet. The schools that are bringing animals into schools are definitely, the ones that are actually the most progressive. Yes, it's annoying, I know, but yeah, dogs help a lot. But I think it's that ability to step in and step out, and for the kid to feel comfortable that I'm actually having a bad day and I'm in an environment where I feel comfortable enough to talk to my teacher or to somebody who will then give me that breathing space to actually try and get back together. A lot of schools are doing it well, but the problem is not a kid that scores a wellbeing program 49 out of 100. It's the challenge that they've got to do it. But I think it's that individuality, Liana. Does a kid actually feel they can be themselves? That to be yourself is the ultimate way to address wellbeing.
Just on that, Dean, one of the solutions the kids come up with, as opposed to fewer exams and less stress, was wardrobe.
Yeah.
That was an important factor for them to feeling more safe. Whereas the parents didn't see that as big as an issue.
Yeah.
Is it that being an individual, or what were the drivers behind that being a solution for children, do you think?
It's about being an individual, but the one thing that kids don't feel they have in life until later is control. So they have no control. I don't have a control over when I start school. I don't have control over which place I go to. But if I could have some control over how I look, that would help enormously. So a lot of it is that. But then, as schools will rightly say, the complexity that brings around kids wearing the right runners and the wrong runners, and some kids not having the money to afford it, does layer it up. But it's a really common one. But do I think that one would radically change the way they feel about school? Probably not. No. But they do raise it an awful lot.
I had a question, just probably for Jack or the bank. Is there, we're talking about the fixed rate loan cliff. We've basically halved the amount and cost of our bursaries from about 3 or 4 years back. So we're having a lot of less kind of permanent support. So that kind of concerns me about we've talked about, but is there any data on percentages of families who are on these or on these kind of loans?
Yeah, great question, Rashira. The percentage of all private school parents that are currently on a fixed rate mortgage, I don't know the percentage.
Okay.
I don't know the percentage. Yeah. Dean might know of all NAB customers, perhaps, that percentage. But I'm not sure for this cohort. I'm not sure.
Okay.
It wouldn't be a sizable number, but it'd be enough that would be an issue. I think the bigger question here is if you look at, and then I'm a behavioural economist, I love sentiment surveys, I love to ask people how they feel. If you ask business how they feel at the moment, business conditions are here, and business confidence, as we saw on that, consumer confidence is here. That disconnect is really unusual. What do I believe more? I very much believe the business one, not the consumer one. Not to have a go at other banks' consumer confidence measures, but they don't work. Consumer confidence is one of the worst indicators of how people are actually going to spend. People don't feel the economy has changed till months later, often years later. The reason that our consumer sentiment index, which I didn't show you, is much better than the historically low consumer confidence measure is because we have something in ours that they don't have in theirs, and that is job security. And people, you ask, we have cost of living, government policy, health, other expenses, funding retirement, and jobs as the key stresses. Cost of living stresses up here, job security is right down here. As long as people have a job, you don't see mass defaults. Even when that mortgage cliff comes, yes, some people will be in difficulty, but to talk back to Biliana's positivity point, most people, as long as you keep unemployment down, that's why it's so critical, will not feel, they'll be financially pushed. But there is a point at which, when consumers feel that awful and business feels that good, eventually that will narrow. And 3 more rate hikes might start to push some people really into that cliff situation. But they're not there yet.
And then just to add to that, the challenge that we have at the moment is that, to Dean's point, whilst obviously interest rates are going up and there are some cash flow pressures, we're still spending, and we're spending quite a lot, which means that we won't see the desired impact on inflation that we were hoping to see. So that's that kind of fine balance between in a sense, we need a bit of hardship. We need a bit of a tough environment for everyone to feel a little bit nervous, step back and stop spending so we can kind of rein in inflation. Because if that's not the case, obviously interest rates will continue to hike up. And there is that equilibrium. We'll hit it at some point in time. It's just that fine balance and almost like a dance, right? Where we are hoping that, it's not going to go way too high where, we're starting to see a significant financial distress. In terms of the percentage of fixed rate mortgages, and again, this is probably from a while back now, but I think in terms of, I guess, the overall home lending population we have around, just looking at you, around a third, I believe, was in fixed mortgages. Those will start to come off early next year. Mine is coming off in April next year. So let me tell you, I'm not looking forward to that. That's for sure. There is yet to come. Let's put it that way.
I think we'll wrap up with one final question from Melbourne. Thanks.
Thanks for the presentation, Jane. One of the figures that I was a bit surprised at is the estimate for this year for the inflation of 4.2%.
Yep.
I thought that the recovery in that was fairly quick. With the current situation with the 7.9 inflation,
yep,
how much of that's driven by external factors like the Ukraine and
yep,
China and that? And if those issues aren't resolved,
yes,
do you see that 4.2 being a little bit optimistic?
Yeah, you've got, the perfect storm happened and that you had a bounce back from the pandemic where demand went through the roof at a time when supply was constrained because of the pandemic and the supply chain's been heavily impacted. So people couldn't get access to goods. What we are starting to see is things like shipping rates are coming. We track every quarter businesses' response to our supply chain issues, and labour shortage is a problem. They're coming down. They're not coming down quickly yet, but they are coming down for some sectors. There's no doubt that we track containers. Are they full or not? They're not as full. And what a global growth like that does is slow demand. And if demand's slow, demand for goods slows. Therefore, some of the supply chain pressures will ease. That's built into the assumption that most economists have that inflation is going to come down quite quickly. It's because demand's slowing pretty fast. Having said that, things like labour shortages are still a big problem. In this country, labour shortage, and you understand this better than anyone, educators really well, there's a disconnect between the skills that business want and the skills that currently Australia is providing. If you're in the hospitality sector, opening the borders, bringing backpackers has solved a lot of your problems. If you're in the construction sector, getting skilled labour now is still difficult. So the really nasty one that the Reserve Bank will be worried about is that wage rate. And yes, wages aren't keeping up with inflation. If wages were keeping up with inflation, we would have a massive problem because interest rates wouldn't go up 3 more times. They will keep rising and rising and rising. So the holy grail for the Reserve Bank is wages growth moderates as demand moderates, as unemployment lifts a little bit, and then inflation will come down. That's the base assumption. But you're right, I could paint a horrible scenario where China is in real trouble. If that zero COVID policy didn't work and we had mass problems again where they have to shut down, then you've got a big supply chain problem and inflation goes up. But the best guess is it's going to come down reasonably quickly.
Thank you. Dean and Jake, particularly, thank you so much for obviously coming and joining us today. To all of our guests, clients, bankers, really appreciate your time and your participation. We pride ourselves in being here for our customers in good and bad times. Obviously, there are always challenges, but we're here to help, to talk to you, to assist. If there is anything else that you would like to see as a topic of consideration, obviously we've been doing this and Dean has been absolutely fantastic supporting us with producing the education service for the past 5 or 6 years now. We try to think, big and I guess deep around the topics that may be of interest. But if there is anything that you think should be considered further, would love to hear from you. Any feedback on today's session, again, would be very welcome and appreciated. We will share the presentations. This is our exclusive pre-public launch event with our valued customers today, and early next week we will be sharing the report, the detailed report with the broader public, so keep an eye on that. We will, obviously, our education bankers will email that to you and share that with each and one of everyone. Again, thank you. Thanks for coming. Please stay around to say hello. We would love to obviously talk to you. And for the ones that have to depart, thanks a lot for coming and have a wonderful afternoon. Thank you.